at UNCTAD's Trading Systems, Services and Creative Economy branch within the Division on International Trade and Commodities. I will be your moderator for this session. As some of you may know, this online course is the third of trade policy e-learning series. It is actually the continuation of the previous course on trade policy frameworks, which we closed recently. But UNCTAD plans to repeat the course given the very positive feedback we received from the participants. But that might have to wait until next year. Let me give you some information on this course participation. We are in the second week of the course and we have 413 registered participants from 60 countries, a large majority of which are developing countries. Out of 243 participants who replied to the questionnaire, we have 58% female, 41.6% male, and 0.4% non-binary participation, and 1.2% of participants define themselves as a person with a disability. As for the professional profile of participants, we have 81% from the public sector, meaning government bodies and ministries, 7% from the private sector, 2% from civil society, 4% from universities, mostly researchers and also some students, and 3% UN staff and 3% from other areas. As for the background of participants, we have 33% economics, 19% international relations, 16% law, 4% political science, and 28% from other fields. 22% of participants in this course have already taken an online course provided by UNCTAD. On the progress made in this course, of the participants, of course, 20% of them successfully passed the first quiz. We are only in the second week, so this is a good progress, I think. I would like to remind you that if you complete all 5 modules and pass successfully all the quizzes, at the end of the course, you will be given a certificate signed by Luz Maria de la Mora, Director of the Division on International Trade and Commodities of UNCTAD. There is one prerequisite, though, it is to issue your personal certificate. That is to complete the evaluation survey. Please do complete the survey, which is important for us to improve and tailor our courses based on your needs. Now, I would like to introduce to you our course instructor and today's speaker, Professor Craig van Krastek. Craig will give you an introduction to trade negotiations today. He's a trade consultant and former adjunct lecturer at John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Craig has written a lot on trade policy and WTO. He has 40 years of experience working with UNCTAD and a lot of experience in advising developing countries to find best ways to achieve the goals they would like to achieve. On the course platform, you have a more detailed bio of Craig with links to his books if you'd like to know more about him. After Craig's presentation, we will have a Q&A session. So please leave your questions in the Q&A box, or you can also raise your hand and ask your questions yourselves. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Craig. Craig, please. And thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. And as I'm proving right now, one of the first things I need to do is apologize in advance for the fact that I'm getting my wife's cold, and unfortunately you'll have to hear me cough or clear my throat a few times. It's just part of the season in which we live. Thank you again for the introduction and for the invitation to join you all. I always look forward to these talks. I've been asked to speak on trade negotiations in today's context, and I understand today's context to mean where we are and have been for the last month. Where we've been for the last month is there's been the introduction of new disruption in the trading system as we understand it, and in fact in the entire state system. So if I were normally asked to make an introduction to this subject matter in a normal environment, the way I would proceed is we would start from an abstract theoretical level, and we would start to talk about the the current issues of today only after having covered the broad theoretical issues. What I would like to do is provide you a context that will help you understand the importance and the specificity of some of those trade negotiation theory issues by starting with the environment in which we are today. There's some very important concepts that we have in this course that I think will have a more solid meaning for you if I place them in that context. What I want to do is examine the nature of the shocks to the system and what they mean for trade negotiators. And after that, we'll turn to questions like, what is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or what is the zone of possible agreement? Those good issues. So think of this as an introduction overall to the subject matter of the course by placing it in an immediate context. So what is the main message here? Really, the United States now appears to be intent on engaging in trade wars, and not just with its principal rival, which obviously is China, and we'll talk a fair amount about China. I'm glad to see that we have a number of participants from China, but also even with its closest partners. So you see the Trump administration very interested in engaging in coercive negotiations with its FTA partners, its free trade agreement partners, and even its NATO allies. So a country like Canada, which is both an FTA partner of the United States and a NATO ally, has come in for a lot of focus and confrontation. So my twin aims are, first of all, to place this process, to place this issue of trade wars in an historical analytical framework. And what I want to do is explain how it is that we've gotten to where we are and why it is my view that this may be a protracted confrontation, a confrontation that may last a long time. And I want to then highlight how the concepts in negotiations theory help us to make sense both of the challenges that we're facing and the options that countries have. So again, think of this not as an effort to provide all the answers, but a way to help you frame the questions in order for the subject matter of this course to make more sense overall. So a few additional notes beyond the note I made before that I apologize for my cold appearing. A lot of what follows is from current research that I'm doing on trade wars. I decided about 2 years ago that it looked like we had reached an inflection point in the trading system. So although 12 years ago, I was writing the official history of the World Trade Organization, and 5 years ago, I was writing about how U.S. trade leadership helped to guide the trading system. Where we are now, and where I expected 2 years ago we would be, is one where we talk more about trade wars than trade liberalization. So I've been approaching this from an historical standpoint and looking at past trade wars and asking what they may mean for current trade wars. I have never delivered the material before that I'm going to present to you today. So what you're seeing is material I have been working on that no one else has been presented up until now. One of the consequences of that is I don't know how long it's going to take me to talk. So I apologize in advance. I've been allocated 45 to 60 minutes. I don't know how much of that, if it will be below or above that, but no matter what, we will certainly have time for questions. So even if I seem to be talking too long, my dear friend Ebru will step in and stop me. If I talk too short, then we have more time for Q&A. And I want to stress the fact that everything that follows will be my own views. This should not in any way be mistaken for UNCTAD positions. So I've been very pleased to work with UNCTAD for the last 40 years. I've never been an UNCTAD employee. The one time I was ever an employee of an international organization was briefly hired by the WTO to be their official historian. But I don't speak for anyone, and please don't blame anyone at UNCTAD or elsewhere if you disagree with the views that I have. I would love to hear your disagreements or your agreements because it will help me to guide my current research. So, having said that, putting the new environment in an analytical and historical context. And I'm going to work with some of the ideas that we included in the previous course on trade policy framework. So some of you who may have taken that course, some of this will be familiar to you, but for a lot of you, it should be new. It's a lot to cover, so forgive me if I try to compress a great deal of material into a relatively short time. I am by training a political scientist and an historian. So if you ask me to look at the trading system, I'm going to do it from both of those perspectives, where the past matters, but also a political approach to the issues, as opposed to a legal or an economic approach to the issues. If you ask a political scientist what shapes the trading system, our first answer is going to be power. It's going to be the power relations between states. There is a field within international political economy into which I fall that takes the view of what is called hegemonic stability theory. And hegemonic stability theory, to summarize it as quickly as possible, is we tend to have more open markets if there exists a hegemon, which is to say a country that has both the authority and the interest in having a relatively open trading system. In periods where we do not have a hegemon, we tend to have more trade conflict and more trade barriers. And so in any given period of history, the three questions I want to ask are, one, what types of great powers are competing for hegemony? That is to say, of the leading countries in the world, and some people, when they look at great powers, they say there's 2 of them, or there's 3 of them, or there's 8 of them. In my own research, I say currently we have 10 of them. 4 of them are regional great powers, 4 of them are global great powers, 2 of them are the contenders for hegemony, and the 2 contenders for hegemony are the United States and China. But what types of great powers, and I'll talk about the type of a great power one may be. Has one of them achieved hegemony? Sorry, that should be hegemony, not hegemon. Whether one has achieved hegemony, and if so, what its ideology is, what its view on trade policy is. I would argue that at present we don't have a hegemon. Very recently we did, but we do not anymore. And finally, what is the place of trade in the strategies of the various great powers? And part of my argument will be that in some respects, our current environment bears a closer resemblance either to the period of British hegemony, which I define as 1846 to 1931, or to the chaotic period between the hegemonies, than it does to the period of American hegemony, which was 1934 to 2017. If you try to understand what the United States is doing now by looking at what the United States was doing 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, you may have a more confused view of the world than if you compare it to where we were in the early 1930s, or indeed where we were in the 19th century. And I'll explain why that is the case. If you compare the United States and the United Kingdom in their respective hegemonies, there's actually a very similar arc over time, an arc in which each of these powers ascended and then descended. And there's a certain parallel in even the years. So when did each power acquire a great power status or a status above that of the other great powers? In each case, it was in the peace after a world war. So in 1815, the British take a leading position in the post-Napoleonic peace. In 1918, almost exactly 100 years later, the United States is taking a leading position after World War I. Both of them move towards trade leadership, in the British case, 1823, in the US case, 1923, by adopting rules that allow for trade negotiations. They both acquire the capacity to be leaders by switching from internal taxes, switching from external taxes to internal taxes. That is to say, by having direct taxation within the country and not relying on tariff revenue. That's a very key reform. The definitive British commitment to freer trade comes in 1846 when they repeal protectionist agricultural legislation, the Corn Laws. The definitive US commitment is in 1934, and the clock starts running in each case from there. I would say the British hegemony beginning in 1846, it finally definitively ends in 1931 when they go off the gold standard. The US clock begins ticking in 1934. I would argue that 2017, which was the start of the first Trump administration, was in effect the end of American hegemony. Various steps along the way, both with respect to the types of investments that the hegemons were making in their military power, with respect to their move away in their descent by imposing negative discrimination, protectionism, but also by moving towards positive discrimination, which is to say preferential treatment of certain partners. If you're going to be the hegemon who provides for an open trading system, you have to have equal treatment. If you're engaging in preferential treatment, you're moving away from that responsibility. So this peak of British hegemony, it's an 85-year period. The peak of American hegemony is an 83-year period. A certain symmetry here. The British hegemony eventually ended when they engaged first in negative discrimination and then the positive discrimination of the Ottawa system in 1932. The United States never really stopped employing protectionist measures, but it was really the US move towards discrimination, I would argue. The negotiation of free trade agreements that was a first step in the movement towards the United States no longer acting as a hegemon. If the United States were still acting today the way it did early in its hegemony, which is to say the 50-year period from 1934 to 1984, we would be talking in this course primarily about multilateral trade negotiations and stressing the importance of what are called integrative negotiations, very key concept in trade negotiation or in negotiations theory overall. We instead are in a period where we're dealing with distributive negotiations. Integrative negotiations are win-win negotiations, especially those where you can place a number of issues on the table. That's what GATT and then the WTO were all about. It becomes somewhat different once in late hegemony, the United States is negotiating more free trade agreements. There was a time when the US FTAs were complementary to the multilateral negotiations. They eventually overtook them, and we have been for the last 10, 15 years in an environment where countries really are negotiating almost exclusively discriminatory agreements. And so that's sort of a halfway step towards instead where we are today in the post-hegemonic system, where the type of trade negotiations in which the United States engages, and let's not just say the United States, because the hegemon or the former hegemon sets the tone that other countries follow. I believe more and more negotiations in the trading system will be more of a distributive type than an integrative type, which is to say more of them are about who wins and who loses than about how we can win together. But we'll return to those concepts in the last part of this presentation. So here is the framework. Here is the taxonomy through which I examine the relations between great powers in a system. This is part of what we covered in the previous trade policy frameworks course, but this will be new material for most of you. I look at the great powers at any period and I ask two questions about what their economic stance is. First of all, what is their market power? I define market power as a country's share of global imports. So a country can have either a very high share or a relatively low share. Secondly, it's market exposure. Market exposure is exports of that country relative to its GDP. So a country can have relatively low market exposure. It doesn't depend very much on exports, or it can have high market exposure. It depends a lot on exports. And really, these are both along a spectrum. But for the moment, let's pretend that it's high or low in either case. From these two characteristics, I identify three different types of great powers. Most countries are not great powers. Most countries are what I call exposed countries. Exposed countries have low market power and high market exposure. And that is the typical position of most developing countries and indeed most developed countries today. But if you are a great power, you can be a political great power. A political great power is one that has high market power, low market exposure. That's where the United States is today. And that is what China is increasingly becoming. Or you can be a commercial great power, which is high market exposure and high market power. That's what the United Kingdom was. You could also be disengaged. Disengaged has low market power, low market exposure. That's what the Soviet Union was. That's what China was in the 1960s and the 1970s. That's what ancient Sparta was. Why is it important to classify countries in this way? Well, it tells you a lot about what their objectives are in the trading system. It also tells you a lot about what sort of instruments they may use in pursuit of their goals in the trading system. And you might think to yourself, well, commercial great power, that must be a country that is going to use its market more. No, as a matter of fact, a political great power is in a better position to, in effect, weaponize its market, to use its market as an instrument of leverage, precisely because it has relatively low market exposure. Because its power is determined by its share of global imports. That's how much influence it can have in dealing with other countries. But if it has a high level of market exposure like the United Kingdom did, it wants to avoid taking actions that might affect it negatively. Whereas if it has a low level of market exposure, it can take actions that affect other countries' access to its market without doing great damage to itself. Now, let me put this. Sorry, yes? Was someone said something. I heard a noise. All right, let me return to what I was saying. Here's the historical comparison. And I'm going to compare where we were in the 19th century in British hegemony, where we were in the 20th century in American hegemony, and then I'll turn to where we are in the 21st century. And in each case, I'm going to be presenting data on contending great powers. I'm going to look at their market power in the vertical axis. I'm going to look at their market exposure in the horizontal axis. And by the way, the size of these circles indicates the relative level of defense spending. So the larger a circle, the more a country is spending on its defense, and it's always measured against the spending of the highest spending country. So in looking at the 19th century, let's ignore in the left-hand side, ignore the United States and France. They're important, but what's really of interest to us is the relationship between the United Kingdom and Germany. And when we look at the Cold War, for the moment, let's ignore France and the United Kingdom and Germany. Let's look only at the Soviet Union and the United States. Because in each case, what we have in those pairs of countries are the contenders for hegemony. So in the 19th century, what's interesting is that both the hegemon, the United Kingdom, and its challenger, Germany, they were both commercial great powers. That is to say, they both had high levels of market exposure and market power. And in their competition, they were dealing not with market restrictions, but with market liberalization. So Germany was the major negotiator of market liberalizing agreements in the lead up to the First World War. And you see that over time, Germany in 1870 versus the United Kingdom in 1870, there was really no comparison. But by the time you get to 1913, Germany is holding more or less the same position in the world as the United Kingdom was. And trade was central to the competition between this pair of commercial great powers, but it was trade liberalization, not trade restrictions they were dealing with. Very different from where we are in the Cold War. In the Cold War, trade was really not an important part of the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, at least not directly. The United States was not dealing much with the Soviet Union in trade, or vice versa, because you had on the one hand a political great power like the United States, for which export interests were less important, And you had a disengaged great power like the Soviet Union, for whom trade overall was really quite unimportant. The Soviet Union was an autarky. And autarky meaning it did not trade much with the rest of the world. And to the extent that it did trade with the rest of the world, it traded more within its bloc than outside its bloc. So why is all this important? It's important in part for understanding how different the world is today that we live in than the world that many of us, if we're old enough, we lived in during the Cold War, which is we came to believe during the Cold War that there was a great disassociation between trade and power politics. Well, there was at the tactical level, but at the strategic level, in fact, the United States was using trade to try to build up the economies of its major trading partners in the West, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and others. But trade and power politics seemed not to be part of the same world. Now, I would argue that the world we're in today is a lot like what we were in the 19th century in several respects. One is the absence of an effective international organization to police the rules. Now, you may object and say, well, we have that. We have the WTO. The key word here is effective. And I'm very sad to say this. As I say, I was the official historian of the WTO for a time. But I think any objective observer would agree that the WTO has not lived up, or I would say the members of the WTO have not lived up to the expectations of what we should be doing. The WTO has had far less progress than the GATT did in its time. So, excuse me. So, in the absence of an effective international organization to police the rules, states are more free to act unilaterally, including unilateral changes in tariffs. And if you look at the way, especially European great powers, but also the United States, did in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, tariffs were not determined by negotiations. Tariffs were determined autonomously, and countries felt free to raise or lower their tariffs. Also, they felt free to engage in a lot of discrimination among their partners. Some states did not even feel constrained to abide by the agreements that they reached. So, for example, it was not unusual in the 19th century for between a pair of countries that had a tariff agreement for one of them to abrogate that agreement in a tariff war and say, all right, yes, we do have a tariff agreement. We are now abrogating that agreement. So even the agreements that were not abrogated, mostly they were time-bound. So if country A and country B negotiated a tariff agreement, it wasn't like today when you negotiate a free trade agreement, our intention usually is that this should be a perpetual agreement from now to the end of history. But rather they would say for the next 3 years or the 2 years or 5 years, whatever the period was, this is how long that agreement will be in effect. In short, what's going on in the 19th century? We have a period where countries are engaged in constant negotiations, and nothing was ever definitively settled. In an environment, excuse me, where the linkages between trade policy and foreign policy were very strong. So when you had rivalries between great powers in Europe, trade was one of the instruments by which they engaged with one another, sometimes cooperatively, often in a confrontational fashion. And I think we may be returning to that. And negotiations may increasingly center not on creating opportunities, but on determining outcomes. And they may be, again, these key words to which we will return in this course, distributive rather than integrative. It's not to say that the Cold War period tells us nothing. The one thing that is most like the Cold War in our world today is the likelihood that we may see countries feeling under pressure to side with one or the other of the leading powers. So the Cold War, an awful lot of it was fought at the periphery. It was not about the United States and the Soviet Union directly engaging with one another, but trying to win the hearts and minds of countries in the rest of the world. Sometimes that involved warfare. Sometimes it involved foreign aid. It didn't involve trade as much. The Soviet Union, as I say, was an autarkic power, but we at least have this similarity that to the extent that countries begin to see, see the global system dominated by the United States on one hand and China on the other, they may feel compelled to choose. Now, you may say to yourself, well, can't a country negotiate free trade agreements with as many partners as it wants? Yes, typically. However, that may be changing in two respects. One is in the United States, our agreements are becoming less like free trade agreements as traditionally defined and more like market sharing arrangements. And secondly, there was a precedent set in the first Trump administration where the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, of NAFTA, included a provision that in effect said to Mexico and Canada, you may not negotiate an FTA with China. And to the extent that we may see the United States continuing to insist that you're either with us or against us, and you're either negotiating with us or you're negotiating with the other side, we're introducing an element of blocks, and we are introducing something that is like what might have been the way the Cold War worked out if the Soviet Union were more commercially engaged. So that's an issue for the future. Another way to calculate this, another way to look at it, is how different the world is now from the GATT, when the trading system as we understand it had really a great congruence with, a great relationship with the security system, which is to say that the countries that were in GATT and were active in GATT were primarily the United States and its allies. And the countries that were outside GATT were either neutral or in the Soviet bloc. Now, what I've done here is this is data, import shares that are represented in GATT and the WTO according to the security affiliation of countries. And the United States has actually had a remarkably stable share of global imports over the last 70 years or so. The other NATO members shown in blue, and I adjust that as countries enter NATO. So even though NATO is much larger in its number of countries today than it was in the late 1940s, they account for actually a smaller share of global imports. Other major US allies, Australia, Israel, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand. We did have a few allies of the Soviet Union that were in GATT, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, eventually Romania, Hungary, Poland, but they were sort of an oddity. And the countries that are shown in purple, all other GATT contracting parties, most of them were actually not very active in GATT. So GATT was, in effect, an institution that was defined as technically not an institution, but an institution where membership was technically, again, not membership. There were contracting parties to this agreement. They happened to coincide with the security arrangements of the United States, and there was generally, among the countries participating in the GATT, a sense of shared economic and security interests. We have in the WTO now a near universal institution. A near universal institution. Almost all countries in the world are either in or negotiating to get in. Certainly China and the Russian Federation are in the WTO. Do not yet account for anything close to a majority of global imports, and yet what we have is the perception in the United States for the last decade or two that it would not be in the US interest to liberalize multilaterally, because whatever cuts in US trade barriers are made on an MFN basis within the WTO would benefit China and the Russian Federation and others with whom US relations have grown progressively more complicated over time. So we already, prior to the Trump administration, we had a declining American interest in the multilateral trading system and what I call quiet quitting on the part of the United States for these broad reasons. And now we have an administration that not only questions the value of WTO membership, but questions the value of NATO membership. So The chances that the United States will still be in NATO 4 years from now, I would say, are still much greater than the chances that it will still be in the WTO. But it's entirely possible that we could see a US departure from both institutions. And there's definitely a good chance that the United States will either leave, or at least explicitly threaten to leave, the WTO in the near future. By the near future, I mean by the middle of this year. So, can the WTO survive without US participation? I would ask you to think back on what the League of Nations was like when it started out without the United States as a member. And over time, Germany, Japan, Italy, the Soviet Union, all either voluntarily or involuntarily left the League of Nations. A multilateral institution in which the largest participants do not participate may not be viable. The International Trade Organization, which was negotiated in 1947, chiefly as a US proposal, but the US Congress was not willing for the United States to join. The ITO never even came into effect. So what does all this mean? Multilateral negotiations were already complex, already difficult, already failing 10 years ago. Their prospect today and for the foreseeable future is even more doubtful. So now let's apply this schema of market power, market exposure, and archetypes to the current relations between the United States and China. Now, the data that I have here are somewhat better than what I was showing you before, because now we can look not only at trade in goods, but also trade in services. What I find fascinating about the last 50 years here is the stability of the US archetype and the instability of the Chinese archetype. What do I mean by that? I mean that the United States, for all of the last 50 years, has been a political great power. That is to say, relative to the world as a whole, bearing in mind that today the typical country in the world has a market exposure of about 45%. The United States is one of the least trade-dependent countries in the world, and yet it is the largest import market in the world. So it is the very definition of a political great power. It is a country for whom it matters much more to the trading system than the trading system matters to it. China, over the last 50 years, has demonstrated all three types of great power archetype. That is to say, if you look 50 years ago when the Cultural Revolution was ending, during the Cultural Revolution in China, China was very much a disengaged power. You can argue about whether China was a great power or not. Certainly, in demographic terms, China was. Economically, militarily, it's an arguable point. But what happened at the end of the Cultural Revolution, and for the generation that followed, China was on a path to becoming a commercial great power. And you can see that in where we go from 1990 to 2005, which is to say there's a huge increase in China's market power. There's also a huge, even greater increase in China's market exposure. And this is a direction that the United States was actively encouraging. Why? Because the expectation was that China, as a commercial great power, would be a good partner in the global system of states, economically and otherwise. But then there's a very important change that takes place around 2005. And especially those of you who are from China, if you disagree with what I say on the following, that's actually very helpful to me, because I would like to know if I'm getting it right or wrong. But my understanding is that the 11th five-year plan is the turning point. So when China moved in the 11th five-year plan, which covers the period of 2006 to 2010, the major change is the prioritization of domestic over export-led growth. Or to put it very simply, it seems to me that China had spent by that time a generation growing without necessarily, in the fullest sense, developing. And at that point, the decision was, let's take this growth that we've been achieving and devote it to the well-being of the people for development purposes. Speaking just for myself, The first time I was in Beijing was in 1993, and I was working on an UNCTAD project where we were helping China to negotiate for its accession to what was still the GATT. This is before WTO accession. And I was in Beijing last year teaching at the University of International Business and Economics. The Beijing that I saw in 1993 and the Beijing that I saw last year were very, very different places. And to the extent that the country moved not just from economic growth to economic development and investment in its people, this can be seen. And I also did a lot of traveling in the country, and it's really quite remarkable what has been achieved. But from my perspective today, what's most important is not these important issues of Chinese economic development, but what it meant for China's archetype. So in 2005, China is en route to becoming a commercial great power, changes direction so that today it is headed towards political great power status. It has a market exposure that is much less than the world average. It's still not as low as that of the United States, but it's headed in that direction, notwithstanding the fact that its share of global imports has doubled. So China is half as exposed as it was in 2005. It is twice the market power that it had in 2005. And also the relative size of its military has been increasing apace as well. Why is this important? In the 19th century, we were seeing competition between Germany and the United Kingdom that was commercial great power versus commercial great power. They were interested, both of them, in trade liberalization, not in trade restrictions. In the Cold War, trade didn't really matter because you had a political great power versus a disengaged great power. If the rivalry today is between two political great powers, both of which have relatively low market exposure, and this is the thing that really surprises most people when I talk to them, is they assume that because China figures so largely in the global economy, that must mean the global economy figures largely in China. And I would say that that was true in 2005. It is less true today because of this change in archetype. One of the consequences is, to the extent that we see the emergence of a trade war between the United States and China, it could be very protracted. Why may it be very protracted? Because neither country is as dependent on the global market as are its partners. So two things emerge from that. One is, in each case, it looks like using one's domestic market as leverage is a very good way of persuading another partner. Secondly, to the extent that one's rival may be using commercial measures as a means of trying to influence you, you are relatively less vulnerable to that. That is to say, countries with low levels of exposure have low levels of vulnerability, therefore they can better weather a trade war. A trade war could go on a very long time between these countries. And all of this came before Trump. But with Trump, it's vastly accelerated, vastly accelerated. So what is the principal way that up until now, the United States and China have been competing? Has up until now been the negotiation of free trade agreements. Sorry, this is a little fuzzy. It's from a manuscript I have, so I just copied it and pasted it in here. Actual and potential FTA partners of the United States and China. So the Chinese partners I have shown as those who have an agreement in effect or various levels of some sort of planning or potential. The US partners, agreements in effect, or those that were negotiated but not approved, like the TPP was not approved in the United States, negotiations suspended or failed, etc. Two things stand out here. One is that there are very few countries that have FTAs with both China and the United States. Two large economies, Australia and Korea, and then 5 other relatively smaller economies have FTAs with both the United States and China. Second point is the real activity on this chart for the last decade or so has been only on China's part, not on the US part. The United States has not been actively or successfully negotiating FTAs for a decade now. So several questions remain about US policy on FTAs. Will the Trump administration renew its FTA efforts? Under the previous Trump administration, there were negotiations underway with the European Union and the United Kingdom and Japan and Kenya. None of those negotiations resulted in an agreement. There was a semi-agreement with Japan, but I wouldn't really count it. It wasn't anything like a free trade agreement. Or, as I expect, will it really revert to market sharing negotiations? Will it continue to pressure other countries not to reach FTAs with China? Very critical question, because at that point, FTAs become not just instruments of freer trade, but the core of a bloc. So not about trade agreements that are complementary to multilateralism, but that are contradicting the letter and the spirit of multilateralism. Will the United States honor its existing FTAs? The evidence suggests it will not, because the United States, who is the Trump administration most threatened besides China? Canada and Mexico. Canada and Mexico have been FTA partners of the United States for over a generation. And I would argue that there's actually a logic to that, because those countries are the ones you can more easily push around because they depend more on their access to the US market. And will the United States demand more renegotiations of existing FTAs, as it did in the case of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is now called the US-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, or the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. However it answers these questions, this administration can be expected to treat trade negotiations more as distributive than integrative opportunities. Again, these key ideas to which we will return. So now is the time to ask, what are these main ideas we need to learn from negotiations theory? You've heard me refer repeatedly to integrative versus distributive. I've also made mention of the ZOPA and the BATNA. This is all by way of giving you a context to think about what these different ideas mean in the current environment and the environment we expect in the years to come. So, from my perspective, if you get nothing else out of the course, I want to make sure that everyone understands three major points: the importance of distributive versus integrative, what we mean by the zone of possible agreement, and what is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Beyond those 3 points, and as discussed in the next slides, it's also important to understand oneself and one's negotiating partner. We covered a lot of that in the Trade Policy Frameworks course, but this is sort of the overlap between the Trade Policy Frameworks course and the negotiations course, which is a good negotiator will be someone who understands not only their own country's positions, but the other country's positions. And it's actually harder to understand your own positions than you might think. An awful lot of effort has to go in the preparation for a negotiation, because you have to deal with other ministries and you have to reconcile sometimes a very different interest within a country to decide what your goals are going to be in a negotiation. But we talked about that already in the Trade Policy Frameworks course, and I do hope that we have the opportunity to present that course as well. But one point from that I want to stress here is the importance of understanding your negotiating partner, and that's the problem of bounded rationality. Bounded rationality is the phenomenon by which we think that other people think the way we do, which is not necessarily the case. It may be that your negotiating partner sees the world in a very different way than you see the world. And it's very important when dealing with the United States today to understand that the way this administration views the world is very different from the way that prior administrations have been viewing the world going back the last 80 years or so. So if you think you understand the United States based on what the United States was doing 10, 20, 30 years ago, you have to think about it again. But let's talk about those three major issues. And this is the most important to understand, and this is where I want to integrate what I've said up until now about the current negotiating environment with negotiations theory. understanding the difference between a distributive and an integrative negotiation. And it really comes down to, in the end, an attitude. Is your negotiating partner one who believes in win-win outcomes, or is your negotiating partner one who believes in win-lose outcomes? If you're dealing with someone who, I'll refer here to someone I really enjoyed working with in my WTO history, Paul Tron, who was the chief negotiator of the European Union in the GATT and in the WTO in that period of transition from one institution to the next. I once asked Ambassador Paul, what is the key to being a good negotiator? And he said it was looking out for the interests of your partner. And this is a very classic idea, which is we should have win-win outcomes and we should be trying to come to agreements that we all benefit from. If you ask Donald Trump the same question, he would never give that same answer because it's a view of the world that is very zero-sum, which is anything that I get is at your expense and vice versa. And that's the way they view everything. That's the way they view defense spending. That's the way they view even territory, right? Any territory that is held by someone else is territory not held by you. Therefore, it's a loss to you. But different types of negotiations can be structured in a way that they either encourage us to think about them as distributive or encourage us to think about them as integrative, distributive being, again, whatever I get is at your expense or vice versa. Integrative, especially if we're including two or more issues. It's not just a negotiation along a single question like the price of something. Obviously, if you're negotiating over the price of something, the seller's range of acceptable prices, the buyer's range of acceptable prices. Here's the example used in this course. Let us say that the seller is trying to sell a watch to the buyer. Any additional dollar that the seller gets is at the expense of the buyer. Any dollar that the buyer is able to convince the seller to reduce the price is at the expense of the seller. The zone of possible agreement, which we get from negotiations theory, is you want to understand where can you come to an agreement? Is there a zone within which we can get to yes? That's very important. But to understand that this is a distributed negotiation by its very nature, because it's about one dimension. And that one dimension is one where whichever partner drives the better bargain, they do so at the expense of the other partner. And understand that when you're dealing with this administration, you are going to be dealing with people who view almost all issues in the world as being win-lose rather than win-win. Now, that's different from the type of environment in which we've been negotiating in GATT and the WTO, and especially the WTO, or especially the Uruguay round of GATT, which leads to the WTO, because this was the theory that the more issues we have on the table, the better able we are to reach win-win solutions, because I give up something on an issue that matters to you, you give up something on an issue that matters to me, but in the end, we can find ourselves within a ZOPA where we're both better off. I tried to express this in the document that is associated with this course just by showing two issues. So let us suppose one state is very interested in market access for goods, another state is interested in intellectual property commitments. And in each respect, you could have either a modest outcome or an ambitious outcome. We're much more likely to come up with a win-win solution if we can have multiple issues on the table. And of course, it gets much more complicated if we have, let's say, 7 or 8 or 9 issues on the table, but I don't know how to represent that graphically on a two-dimensional space. So I've just simplified it here by saying, if we have a range of outcomes that are acceptable to country B with respect to both of these issues, and a range of outcomes that are acceptable to country A, we have a ZOPA within which each one of them can say, when they come back home with the agreement, we have done well. We had to give something up on market access, but we got what we really wanted on intellectual property, or vice versa. The problem, as I see it, is how do we deal with negotiations where there is no ZOPA? How do we deal if your negotiating partner enters the negotiation with a view that what they are after is winning at your expense, and they want to turn a multidimensional negotiation into one where on each issue, they're willing to accept only those things that are on their side. There is no ZOPA. That becomes very difficult. And I anticipate that as hard as our negotiations have been within the WTO and outside of the WTO for the last generation or so, we're now in the 24th year where theoretically the Doha round is still underway, only theoretically. We don't have a death certificate yet for it, but otherwise, the Doha round is not among us anymore. That already has been difficult, but in the current environment, I see more and more negotiations that if they are pursued as win-lose and the demands made are very difficult, we're not going to come to negotiated agreements except, and this is where the BATNA comes in, you may see the United States increasingly taking a very different approach in negotiations where it is linking issues in ways that we are not used to seeing issues linked. So for the last generation or two, the negotiating approach of the United States had been to say to a negotiating partner, no agreement is better than a bad agreement. What does that mean? We say, we've sat down to negotiate the WTO and an FTA, wherever we've negotiated, we have presented our position, we have let you know what it is we want, we've seen your view, and we don't really like the proposals that you've put forward, so we're going to walk away until you're willing to take the position that we have presented or something like it. It's a negotiating strategy, it's a bargaining approach, but basically you say, take it or leave it. We've presented you our position, your position is unacceptable, so our negotiations have come to a standstill. Often this works to get a better deal from the US perspective out of the other side. It's a form of confrontation, but it's a limited form of confrontation where you say, this negotiation might work or it might not work, but it's only this negotiation. You may increasingly see where the United States has proposed to a country, we want to negotiate on an issue. If you do not agree to our position as a trade negotiation, there are other ways that we can bring pressure on you. There are other forms of potentially coercive negotiations in which we are prepared to engage. And so from this perspective, the US BATNA is to go outside of trade negotiations. That is to say, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement for the United States is no longer no agreement. It is, we're still going to pursue what we want. We're going to do it outside the context of a trade negotiation. So all countries in all negotiations always need to know what their own BATNA is. That's part of what is stressed in this course. But I think I'm going to conclude on this point, which is we're entering an environment where when you're dealing with the United States, you have to know what the US BATNA is. And at least in terms of public rhetoric, the types of things that you're going to hear US negotiators and policymakers claim is, all right, if you don't negotiate with us on this issue, there's something that we can do unilaterally. We can use other forms of leverage. We can use other ways of achieving an outcome. And sometimes they get quite extreme in the rhetoric, saying things like everything is on the table, that there's no option that is off the table. Anyone who's been paying attention to the news for the last month or so will recognize the types of things to which I'm referring. So when you go through the course, when you encounter concepts like integrative versus distributive, the ZOPA and the BATNA, I hope you can see in the context that I provided here a sense of how these work into our thinking, and also understand how these concepts in return, going in reverse, help us to understand the differences between the environment we are in now versus the type of stalemate environment we were in 10 years ago, versus the type of cooperative negotiating environment that we were in 30 years ago. And just to return to ideas that we were presenting earlier in this discussion, a lot of that has to do with, over time, the movement from a system in which there is an active and engaged hegemon to a system where that hegemon is increasingly employing measures that are outside of what we expect a hegemon to do: negative discrimination in the form of ever more protectionism, positive discrimination in the form of ever more preferential treatment, the deterioration over time of support for a multilateral, non-discriminatory trading system. All of this tells you that a fair amount of the things that we're seeing taking place today had already been anticipated in changes that were taking place in the domestic and international politics of U.S. trade policy, but they have now been vastly magnified and accelerated. So I'm going to stop now. I think I've given you a fair amount of material, and just about the amount of time I was asked to speak. So 55 minutes, not bad. All right. I am going to turn the floor back to Ebru. I'm going to stop sharing. Let's see, so that we can all see one another. And Ebru, you have the floor.
Thank you, Craig. Well done. You were your estimates on timing was, I think, correct. We have some questions from the audience. There's one question in the Q&A box. You can see it maybe for yourself, but I'll ask Worku Alemayehu, who asked the question, if he wants to ask it by himself. Can you hear us, Worku?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, please go ahead to ask your question to Craig.
So this is Worku from Ethiopia. Thank you for this opportunity. This is a really very live presentation. Thank you, Craig. So my question was, like, you were mentioning that there is an absence of like an effective global institutions like WTO. So you questioned its effectiveness, and also you said that other global institutions, as far as trade issues are concerned, they are not doing effective, if I understood you well. So currently, this is an unfortunate situation, but in the absence of such an effective global institutions like WTO, is it really possible to strengthen or establish like a regional or continental institutions, like, for instance, in the case of Africa, we do have AFCFTA. So is it like really worthwhile or advisable to strengthen such institutions to be much more effective in respective regions or continents, so that ultimately we could have a global which is based on the best experiences that these regional institutions are like witnessing? That's my question. I also have another comment, if you allow me to go on, yeah?
Yes,
I go on with another, yeah?
Go ahead, please.
Okay. So it is very unfortunate that you question the survival of WTO without USA. So I personally believe that the survival of institutions, global institutions like WTO, is not as such very much, must not be as such very much dependent on a single member or a group of members. Like, for instance, during his first term of the USA presidency, Mr. President Trump like withdrew from the membership of WHO, I mean. And his second term, he is also challenging WHO and other institutions too. So this experience, this real very unfortunate real situation, that the world is facing should be considered as a very lesson whereby those global institutions should never be dependent on a single member or a group of members in terms of like mobilizing resources, in terms of making decisions, in terms of like being advantageous or being disadvantageous in decision-making areas. So this must, to my opinion, this must be taken as a very like unfortunately, a lesson whereby such global institutions should be like reoriented or think themselves as an opportunity whereby they can be really, they can no more be challenged by a single institution or a group of institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Those are excellent questions and extremely well stated. So let me say as well that I very much enjoyed the times that I've been in Ethiopia working on Ethiopian WTO accession, the value of which may not be as great today as we thought it would be 10 or 20 years ago. Regional liberalization. I have noted several times in the last decade or so that, in fact, the world would be better off if more countries were following Africa's lead. The African negotiations, both at the regional and the continental level, have been very impressive. And there has been, certainly there's a range of opinion within different African countries, and some have been more actively engaged. But at the continental level, certainly, if you wanted to look around the world, Africa has been more active and more effective in this respect than others have as well. And certainly, let us say that you are in a country that is not the United States or China or one of the other great powers. And the question is, does that prevent you from liberalizing? No, of course not. Certainly you can act unilaterally to promote trade. You can engage in bilateral negotiations. You can engage in regional negotiations. Bear in mind, however, that collectively, there's a certain stability over the last 70 years or so, where if you add the United States, the European Union, and China together, those three account for half of the global market. The main change has been that the United States has been sort of stable, the European Union has actually decreased a bit, and China has increased quite a bit. But you add those three together and half the global market is at issue there. So there's a lot to be achieved in regional liberalization, but it's not, it's half the problem. Your relations within your own region or with other regions that do not encompass those three major markets, very important, and you're not prevented from negotiating with one another, but it's really going to cover half of potential consumption. So I don't want to leave the impression that the relations between the United States and China, or the relations between any set of great powers, determines the entirety of what we can do. But it certainly has an extremely important effect both on the multilateral institutions and on the precedents that are set for relations elsewhere. Just as an aside, the African Growth and Opportunities Act, you may be well aware, is the current authorization is expiring. So this is the program by which the United States has, since the year 2001, extended very good preferential treatment to most sub-Saharan African countries. The Trump administration has taken the position that it is a giveaway. And again, this is within the context of viewing almost any outcome in zero-sum terms. So although there had been an expectation that there would be renewal of AGOA, that's very much in doubt in the current administration. So your point about whether any institution should depend on any single member is extremely well stated, and you're quite correct. But let me draw a distinction here between the types of institutions that provide what we call global public goods and the types of institutions that become a negotiating forum for the members. The WTO is intended to be primarily two things: a negotiating forum between its members. So there already, if you have a major country that is not engaging in those negotiations, of course, it's not being covered by that. And it's also supposed to be a dispute settlement forum. And again, if that country is either not participating in the dispute settlement, or if it is not honoring the results of dispute settlement cases, both of those detract from the capacity of the WTO to achieve its objectives. But most other multilateral institutions are not negotiating forums in that sense. They provide global public goods. And the major problem of the United States not participating in, for example, the World Health Organization, twofold. One is it won't be paying its share for this global public good. Secondly, it'll become a free rider. What do we mean by a free rider? A free rider is a country that takes advantage of a public good that is provided by another institution without paying for it. And in economic theory, public goods are a very important collective action problem, and there's a lot of theoretical and practical work on this. But bear in mind, the WHO will be perfectly capable of continuing its activities, as will a number of other regional or global institutions. However, understanding that if the United States withdraws from them, it's not going to be paying its share of the dues. It may not be subject to the rules, but these are basically mostly not rulemaking institutions. They are institutions that provide public goods, and the United States may continue to benefit from those public goods without paying its share of them. So there is an important distinction to be drawn there. I would say that the WHO is in a much better capacity, and others like it, to survive the withdrawal of the United States than would, for example, the WTO. And bear in mind, we have had cases in the past. The United States has moved into and out of UNESCO several times, actually, over the course of the last 30 years or so. UNESCO managed to get by without the United States, and it will continue to get by without the United States. However, its budget will be, either it has a lower budget or everyone else has to pay more. But thank you for that question. Ebru?
Yes, thank you, Craig, for this answer. And there's actually a question related to the African context, reminding us that, as you reminded us, AGOA is coming to its expiration at the end of this year. So in the chat, you can see the entire question, but with some comments. The question is, what advice can you give to African countries who will negotiate FTAs with the US in the future? Imagining that there's a non-continuation of AGOA, I think, based on that assumption.
Right. There's actually three different things to, it's a very good question. There are three different things four options, actually. So there are four options that you may see any individual African country facing in the future. One is their relationship with the United States could still be a matter of unilateral preferences if those preferences are in place. The question then becomes whether AGOA gets renewed or not. And if it is not renewed, then whether or not we have continuation of the GSP, which is another troubled program that the United States frequently allows to fall out of effectiveness. So that's one option. I suspect that you will get the Trump administration saying to countries, you no longer get this giveaway, this free ride, as they put it. You have to negotiate with us, but do not assume that the alternative is a free trade agreement. The alternatives fall into three alternatives. One is no agreement at all. You're back to MFN without any preferential treatment, and also potentially subject to the type of unilateral measures that the United States takes. So, for example, when the Trump administration imposed restrictions on steel and aluminum imports, it imposed them on South Africa, as well as other countries that produce, I believe in South Africa's case, it was primarily steel rather than aluminum, but I'd have to go back and check the data. The other two possibilities are, as the question implied, a free trade agreement, yes, but only if the United States goes back to negotiating free trade agreements. And I suspect that no matter what they call them, they may call them free trade agreements, they may call them something else. The Trump administration, in negotiating bilaterally with other countries, will not negotiate things that we would recognize as free trade agreements in the usual sense of things. They're much more interested in market sharing arrangements in which what is under negotiation is not the creation of market opportunities, but the determination of market outcomes. Some of which can be, very directly stated, things like country A will import X number of dollars worth of the following goods from country B. I mean, almost like a barter arrangement. But if you look at the types of agreements that the Trump administration likes to negotiate, they're much more about outcomes than they are about opportunities, which is a radical change. So the question was, what should African countries do? The first thing is you should be aware that if you say to the United States, by the way, we're willing to negotiate a free trade agreement, you may understand that to mean a certain type of agreement. You may say, we want to have the same type of agreement that Mexico has, the same type of agreement that Chile has. From this administration's perspective, they are less likely to say, yes, let's negotiate something like that. They're more likely to say, let's deal with this the way the Japanese prime minister was made to deal with Trump in a recent meeting, in which the Japanese prime minister felt obliged to make a commitment to a specific level of Japanese investment in the United States, which was not like a bilateral investment treaty where you say, we're going to eliminate various barriers to investment, and then we hope that the market comes up with a result, but rather, we're committing to, I forget how many billions of dollars, $100 billion or something over a certain period. Again, that's about outcomes and not about opportunities. So the first bit of advice I would give you is be prepared for the response to be something other than what you have understood free trade agreements to be in the past. And the second is a lot of homework. And this gets back to the trade policy frameworks course about what you need to do in preparation for a negotiation. We cover some of that in this course as well, in understanding your own interests and understanding the interests of your partner.
Thank you very much, Craig. There's another question by Quan Zhao. Do you want to ask your question yourself, or should I read it? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Craig, for a very enlightening session. The question is simple. In your model, where you have listed the market power versus exposure, the measurement for market power was using the share of import in the global import market. But in the current context, would the share or, in the export be constituted as to some extent as market power, especially, as we have more measures on export restrictions on chips and critical minerals and access to technologies and etc. And since, if I may also have ask another question about the WTO. So I think what you said is that the WTO is likely to disintegrate if the US walks away, because other members will find it not useful if we have a major economy not participating. But what are some of the issues that keeps the US in the WTO in the current context, and can we work to strengthen those issues? Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very good questions. Absolutely, exports matter. I say my current research, just to put it in a context, I am writing a book about this, and the overall structure I have is the one that I've shown you. And I say, you know, this is a first cut at how we look at these issues. Then if you want to understand specifically what's going on in a given period or with a given partner or in a certain relationship, there's a lot of other issues we want to take into account. So not all goods are of equal importance here. Historically, there are some goods that are strategic. So in my research, I actually go much farther back than the 19th century. I start with the ancient Mediterranean, and in looking at how Athens and Sparta and Rome and Carthage and Persia related to one another. In those days, the strategic good was food. In the 19th century, the strategic good was steel. In the 20th century, the strategic good was oil. And in the 21st century, as you quite correctly state, the strategic goods are chips or information technology or information services. And certainly in all of these cases, food, oil, steel, chips, one of the instruments of trade war is export restrictions, export bans. For example, in the same way that some people will tell you that the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta began because of trade sanctions that Athens put on a Spartan ally, people will tell you that the Second World War, the United States and Japan, was caused by the United States imposing export restrictions on scrap iron to Japan. So let me just say that you're quite correct that it's not just about imports. I start with imports because that's the most easily understood thing, but we then need to be more detailed in examining the specifics of a case. So definitely, I do look at the chips issue and at all sorts of interventions that are taking place, both on the part of trade and investments that governments are making to subsidize their production. So yes, you're absolutely correct that those things cover a much wider range. When it comes to the WTO, the most optimistic view that people could have of what the Trump administration is currently thinking about is to say, you know, all they're really trying to do is create leverage. And what they want to do is frighten us so that we will negotiate changes in the way the WTO operates, including, for example, how dispute settlement works, including what are the rules with respect to the relationship between trade and security, the interpretation of GATT Article 21, all of these types of issues. That's possible. It's possible that if we were holding this talk a year from today, we'd say, "Whew, look back. We were scared last year that the United States was going to withdraw, but look, they forced certain reforms and everyone made some accommodations and that all went away." I consider that to be the less likely outcome. If you gave me a bet, if you said, "I will bet you $100 that the United States will still be in the WTO a year from now," and I would take that bet. I would bet you the $100 and I think I would win. But I'm not saying that I'm certain about that. So I would say it is more likely than not that within this 4-year period and quite possibly within this 12-month period, the United States will leave the WTO. But it definitely could be that it ends up being a negotiation over WTO reform. It just doesn't seem that way to me. There's really a very important difference between how this administration is acting this time versus how it acted the last time. So if you read accounts of all the internal debates that took place over a period of about 2 years, things like renegotiation of NAFTA and all of that, the institutionalists were able to slow down the changes, were able to redirect some of the energy. The new team came in with a view that they wanted to make as radical a series of changes as possible within as short a time as possible to keep everyone else unbalanced. And it seems to me in that environment, looking for a possible U.S. withdrawal from the WTO, that's both much more conceivable this time than it was last time and much more likely to come quickly. There is a formal review that has been called for of U.S. participation in every international organization. And this review is being conducted by State Department, U.S. Trade Representative, other institutions. It's not just the WTO. And there's a possibility we could see either threatened U.S. withdrawal or actual U.S. withdrawal, conceivably from any international organization. Deborah?
Thank you, Craig. There are some more questions. Actually, two more questions. I would like to use our few minutes. Let me read them quickly because we don't have much time. So about the WTO issue, John Morissette is asking, what can the WTO do if the United States comes to make demands in a logic of win-lose negotiation unfavorable to the WTO? And second, I follow so you can answer to both of them. In the context of what the US has been doing, especially the inherent disintegration of the WTO, what can the non-US trading bloc, meaning the EU, CPTPP, and China, likely to consider to curb this hegemony path pursued by the US? So, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me just slightly restate your the first question, which is it's not what can the WTO do, it's what can the WTO members do. It's just as the former WTO historian, I would say that everyone in the WTO will always say to you, this is a member-driven organization. It doesn't have any existence apart from the members. But both of those questions end up being the same thing. It's just sort of one of them is WTO specific and the other is potentially outside the WTO. But what can countries do in response? It seemed to me that not only has there been a difference in how this administration has approached issues compared to the first term by acting much more rapidly and much more radically than it did in that earlier term. But there was so much advance warning that U.S. trading partners have really been prepared for this, and you can see in the response of Canada, for example. I remember in 2016, within 24 hours of Trump's election, Canada was indicating its willingness to renegotiate NAFTA. Within 24 hours of there being the actual threat of U.S. sanctions on Canada, or penalty duties, call them what you will, not only the Canadian federal government, but the Canadian provincial governments were announcing what they will do in response, which involves also restricting U.S. access to their market. Many other countries are thinking about that. I would divide the world really into three different types right now. You've got those that are willing and able to meet the U.S. demands in kind and say, if you're going to restrict us, we're going to restrict you. You're going to have the countries with which the United States engages directly in confrontations, which is, say, China, the Russian Federation, and a few others. And thirdly, you'll have countries who will ask themselves, is there a possibility for us to benefit from this? Is it possible that if there are major restrictions imposed on the major players, can we nonetheless sort of continue to have access to these markets because we come in under the radar? And so the answer to the question is in part, what type of country are we talking about? There's not a universal answer here. There's a collective action problem because of that third possibility I was suggesting, because there are countries that may think to themselves, there are ways that we could benefit from this. It becomes very difficult to put together any type of overall coalition in opposition, including the fact that this might involve calculating things like, will China be cooperating with the European Union in a collective response to the United States? I don't think so, but all bets are off at this point. When you have NATO members, some spokesman for some NATO members now saying they're beginning to view the United States as an adversary, that's how different the world is today. So what can countries do? There's a lot of possibilities, but collective action problems become very difficult. Again, as I say, it's more, we're seeing something that is less like the Cold War and more like the state system of British hegemony and the constant back and forth and the uncertainty that we were finding, especially in the latter half of the last quarter of the 19th century. The high point of British influence was in the third quarter of the 19th century. By the time we get to the fourth quarter of the 19th century, we had the type of environment we have today where everything seems to be at issue. I know that's not a very hopeful answer. I know you'd like to hear me say, if you do A, B, and C, this will all be resolved. I'm not feeling particularly optimistic about easy solutions.
Thank you very much, Craig, for this very insightful, enlightening presentation. And dear participants and colleagues, thank you very much for joining us today. I just would like to remind the next webinar dates. So 5th of March, we'll have the second webinar of the course, and 19th of March, the third webinar. This is a course with a relatively shorter period of time compared to the other course we just finished. So we hope to see you there. And thank you for joining us. And thank you, Craig, very much.
Thank you.